HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Last Butterflies, a scientist's quest to save a rare and vanishing creature. By Nick Haddad. Read by Eric Jason Martin. Preface. The unique butterfly with which I have been associated has perhaps the best Latinized name in all of science. Inglorious mediocris, loosely translated as the mediocre skipper, is small, with wings that measure about 1 inch across. It is brown, a color broken by a few specks the size and hue of sand grains. One could argue that this butterfly, among the thousands of plants and animals that might be termed mediocre in appearance, deserves its name. I would like to think that the name is comical, and perhaps it is, but more importantly, to me, the mediocre skipper was my first real contribution to the study of rare butterflies. I never set out to be a scientist or a steward of the world's rarest butterflies. I was not a young butterfly enthusiast. I never had a butterfly collection, and I do not remember raising caterpillars. I did not find my passion until later in life. Following my graduation from Stanford University in 1992, I decided to take a job with the Center for Conservation Biology at Stanford to inventory butterflies in northern Guatemala. At the time, I wasn't particularly drawn to butterflies, but work in Guatemala sounded exciting. Several of the center's butterfly biologists accompanied me for the first week. Then they left me in a tropical forest with a tent, a vintage mountain bike, and a butterfly net. They did not trust me, a young student, to identify the area's 500-plus tropical butterfly species, so they left me with one instruction: collect all butterflies and send them to experts. I did so for 2 years. Shortly after completing that task, I left Guatemala to begin graduate school. 5 years passed, and George Austin, a museum scientist and a member of the group that took me to Guatemala, sent me one of his recently published papers. In it, he described some of the novel discoveries contained within the boxes of butterflies I had sent him. One stood out. I learned that we had collected a butterfly that was a species new to science, Inglorious mediocris. At first, that did not seem so novel. After all, we'd collected other new species, including Calephalus tikal, which was named after Tikal National Park, where we caught it during our first week of netting. But as I read the article, I learned that the mediocre skipper was a more unusual find than that butterfly from Tikal. Inglorious was a new genus, a lineage of butterflies potentially millions of years old. A genus is a grouping of similar species that are related by morphology and genetics. For example, the Monarch is in the genus Danius, and there are 12 other species in that genus. I was astonished that the collection I'd mailed George contained something unique. In the 2 decades since, others have collected only 5 more individuals of this species in Guatemala and bordering countries. No other species of the Inglorious genus have yet been discovered. The mediocre skipper impressed on me how much remains to be discovered about the diversity and the potential rarity of butterflies and of insects more generally. I did not study rare butterflies before or in the few years after my research in Guatemala. My honors thesis as an undergraduate student was actually on birds found in oak forest, as I sought to understand how forest loss affected the types of birds that remained. My research sites, in California's San Francisco Bay Area, were immediately adjacent to the grasslands inhabited by a rare butterfly, the bay checkerspot, Euphydryas editha bayensis. However, I never saw it there. I also did not study rare butterflies during graduate school at the University of Georgia. I entered graduate school to continue research on birds. With them in mind, I studied an approach that is used in biodiversity conservation to help the species of an area overcome the negative effects of habitat loss. Landscape corridors are highways for plants and animals that reconnect habitats that have been lost and fragmented. I worked with the U.S. Forest Service to create a large experiment to test the corridor's effects. Shortly after I started this effort, my graduate advisor, Professor Ron Pulliam, nudged me toward studies of common butterfly species. Over the next decade, I found that landscape corridors were superhighways for butterflies and increased butterfly abundances, yet none of the butterflies I studied was rare. I pegged the start of my search for rare butterflies to 2001. I was a new professor at North Carolina State University. At that time, government agencies and conservation organizations were struggling to develop conservation plans for the state's two rare butterflies, the St. Francis's satyr, Neonympha michelii francisci, and the crystal skipper, Atritonopsis quinteri. They asked me to bring my expertise on habitat loss and on butterflies to the conservation effort. I willingly embraced this opportunity. I found these butterflies to be especially enticing because they lived in heavily fragmented environments. Apparently, landscape corridors would speed their recovery. These butterflies and their environments were just what I'd been looking for, a conservation setting in which I could put into practice what I'd learned from my PhD research. As a naive over-optimist, I thought that my scientific expertise was just the ingredient needed to promote rapid recovery. I was going to be these species' savior. A few years after I moved to North Carolina and started my studies of rare butterflies, I had a debate with one of my graduate students, Alison Leidner, about who was studying the rarest butterfly. Was it I, studying the St. Francis's satyr, restricted to 35 acres on an artillery range in one Army installation? Or was it Alison, who was studying the crystal skipper, restricted to a 30-mile-long by 150-foot-wide strip of sand dunes on a barrier island? I am competitive, and I was determined to win this debate. The Army thwarted my efforts, as at that time they would not let me into the artillery range to count the St. Francis's satyrs. As I could not win, I moved on to find a different butterfly to study that might have been even rarer. My decades-long search for the rarest butterfly had begun. I have studied rare butterflies for nearly 2 decades. It turns out that the special window opened by the rarest butterflies has given my science and worldview a unique perspective. These rare butterflies reveal the diversity of life and the potential for loss. Butterflies are the best-known group of insects, and their loss portends that of many other insects that comprise the vast majority of Earth's diversity, excluding microorganisms. In this book, I stitched together stories about the discovery, science, threats, and conservation of the rarest butterflies in the world. While writing these chapters, I sought general insights into causes of butterfly decline and prospects for these insects' conservation and recovery. The lessons I extracted are applicable to other rare plants and animals, not only to butterflies. Chapter 1. A Sliver of Creation. After I started my job at North Carolina State University in summer 2001, I toured the habitats of 2 of the last known populations of the St. Francis's satyr, Neonympha michelii francisci, located at Fort Bragg Army Installation in southern North Carolina. I traveled through pine woods on rutted dirt roads to visit a just-discovered population where the butterfly was easy to spot. This marked the beginning of my research on the St. Francis's satyr. I had some early successes and found a few new populations. This inspired me to continue my search for undiscovered populations in remote wetlands at Fort Bragg. Every summer since, I have trudged through swamps and broken through walls of shrubs and vines. For the most part, my effort has been in vain. My challenges in finding new populations of St. Francis's satyr were emblematic of the science and the search for the rarest butterfly that lay before me. The butterflies that are the subject of this book represent just a sliver of creation. If we were at a dinner party and I asked you to think of a rare animal, what would come to mind? I would expect to hear names of animals such as the giant panda, Ailuropoda melanoluca, the black rhinoceros, Diceros bicornis, or the northern spotted owl, Strix occidentalis corina. Like the butterflies I study, these animals are rare and threatened. Unlike the rarest butterflies, they are large, charismatic vertebrates. These animals are also different in a way that may not be immediately apparent. At least it was not to me. They are not nearly as rare as the rarest butterfly. Rare butterflies make up a small number of the Earth's 19,000 or so butterfly species, and butterflies in general make up a small fraction of the estimated 5.5 million insect species. Relative to other insects, butterflies hold an advantage. They provide us clearer avenues for understanding general threats to biodiversity and pathways to conservation. We know much more about butterflies, their diversity, ecology, and evolution than any other group of insect. We also know more about the size of their populations and about the area of their ranges, which means there are data to support my assessment of rarity. Imagine the increasingly likely scenario in which you could corral all the living adults of all the very rarest butterflies and then hold them in your hands. If, for example, you could hold the entire world population of adult Strauss's swallowtail, Heraclitus aristodemus pontianus, butterflies, its weight would be roughly 6 ounces. The collective weight of all individuals of the 5 rarest butterflies that I discuss in this book would weigh only 3 pounds 5 ounces, as much as one panda's paw. And, in contrast to these tiny populations, there are billions of individuals of such common butterflies as painted ladies, Vanessa cardui, and small cabbage whites, Pieris rapi. The rarest butterflies have not always been rare. Some were very abundant until the last few decades. It is likely that their numbers dropped from millions to thousands. For other rare butterflies, it is impossible to estimate their historical abundance. However, we do know the historic range of their habitats, and from that we can extrapolate high abundances. Global habitat loss and climate change have relegated each species to minuscule land parcels, areas as small as a single golf course or even a football field. I have found rare butterflies in unexpected places, their populations restricted to artillery ranges or beaches or backyards. In every year that I worked and for every species that I studied, I wondered whether I would see the last of these butterflies. The rarest butterflies fly dangerously close to extinction. Numbers are so low that I feared small changes in the area of a forest, the saturation of a wetland, or the level of the ocean would wipe out an entire species. Their numbers and ranges are so small, and the threats are so high, that my encounter with the last butterfly was a real possibility. I have staked much of my professional career on efforts to reverse butterfly population declines. There remains some glimmer of hope in prospects for species recovery. In this book, I recount stories about my and others' progress in understanding the biology and conservation of the rarest butterflies in the world. Moreover, I argue that they stand among the poster animals for the loss of biodiversity and the future of conservation. The rarest butterflies may seem at first a surprising or even undeserving part of this group. They are a small set of virtually unknown animals that may appear more idiosyncratic than emblematic of environmental biology and conservation. Yet, viewed in a deeper way, the rarest butterflies provide a unique lens into growing concerns and problems, the loss of biodiversity on our planet, and the challenges associated with conserving species in peril. Butterflies and global change. The rarest butterflies suffer from headline-grabbing environmental catastrophes, such as habitat loss, climate change, environmental toxins, and invasive species. Often these threats act in concert to reduce their populations. The rarest butterflies, and I argue much of the diversity of life on Earth, are confronted simultaneously with multiple threats that accelerate decline. Even when habitats are viewed as protected, they can be lost from the perspective of the rarest butterflies. This is a key to understanding why the rarest butterflies are so rare. Like the fairy tale character Goldilocks, the rarest butterflies require conditions that are just right. Some butterflies live in habitats maintained naturally by disturbance such as fire. Too much fire over too broad a region will incinerate populations. Too little fire will cause butterfly habitat to disappear through natural processes of succession, causing their host plant, defined as the plant or plants that caterpillars live on and eat, to die. By stopping fire, draining wetlands, and stabilizing beaches, people suspend natural environmental change and upset a delicate balance. Conditions are no longer just right. These insidious threats, cast against a backdrop of major global changes, are slowly eroding the populations that remain. One thing that distinguishes the rare butterflies from other rare species is that they have specialized environmental requirements that exist in places where people also want to be. In some cases, people use land in ways that are incompatible with the habitat required by the butterflies. Some butterfly ranges have the bad luck of being located near dense urban development or large monocrop fields. In other cases, the expanding footprint of people has helped to conserve the rarest butterflies. The St. Francis's satyr, for example, lives only on a mostly undeveloped army base. The message here is that there can be win-win scenarios for people and butterflies. The scope of my search. Is it even possible to identify the single rarest butterfly in the world? As I attempted to do so, I wrestled with issues that arise in the conservation of all plants and animals about how to define what is rare. Many, many butterflies are rare, a number that is too great to cover in many book volumes, let alone in one book. The growing number of rare butterflies is an inevitable consequence of global environmental change. I narrowed my scope to those that I found to be the rarest. As I will discuss, I consulted references worldwide about butterfly population sizes. I failed to identify a species outside of the United States that, after considering range-wide population estimates, was rarer than the rarest species I identified within the United States. In part, the list also reflects my personal journey, restricted mainly to North America. Although others might dispute my assessment and ranking of the rarest butterflies, the conservation needs of each species I describe are not in doubt. To guide my search, I drew heavily on lists of butterfly species that have garnered formal recognition as conservation priorities. As people have increased their attention to butterflies and their rarity, political processes have evolved to favor butterfly protection. As I looked back at the history of butterfly conservation, I saw plainly that the enactment of the U.S. Endangered Species Act, ESA, in 1973 was a watershed. The first butterflies appeared on this list in 1976. Species are recognized or listed as either endangered, in imminent danger of extinction, or threatened, in danger of becoming endangered. While the Endangered Species Act applies to the United States, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, maintains the most prominent worldwide list of species that have disappeared or are threatened with extinction, the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. The IUCN began to document the conservation status of butterflies in 1983. I was attracted to the Red List because it adopted quantitative scales of vulnerability that included population size, range, and change over time. Another international list was compiled, beginning in 1976, pursuant to the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES, an international agreement designed to protect threatened species, including rare butterflies. This list identified rare species in most danger of being moved by people across national borders. Prominent species on the list include tigers and rhinos, the hides, bones, and/or horns of which can be transported across borders. Although less attention is given to butterflies, CITES recognizes species that might be the targets of butterfly collectors. I also consulted results of efforts to monitor butterfly populations, especially over the area of states or nations. The world's most intense and longest-running butterfly monitoring program is the United Kingdom Butterfly Monitoring Scheme, UKBMS. Others include South Africa's intensive records of long-term diversity and status of butterflies, and the annual butterfly counts of the North American Butterfly Association, NABA. Even after I consulted these resources, I recognized that there were surely other rare butterflies awaiting discovery. Those were beyond my purview for this book. I used these resources to narrow the list of the world's rarest butterflies. I gave a great deal of thought into how to assess rarity. Is the rarest butterfly the one with the smallest number of individuals that remain? Well-established scientific theory and observation have shown that biological and genetic factors can drive numbers in small populations down further. Or is the rarest butterfly the species that ranges globally over the smallest area, measured in the tens of acres and often in remote locations? A small area exposes rare species to large and rapid decline. Long-term changes, such as habitat conversion to cities or fields, and short-term changes to the physical environment, such as drought, can change a butterfly's environment quickly throughout its range. Perhaps the rarest butterfly species is the one whose population is experiencing the most precipitous decline. Some of the rarest butterflies flew over large regions until recently, areas the size of half a state or province. In some instances, scientists ignored them until populations declined to the last butterfly. Should I have considered how novel a butterfly is in the context of all butterflies and of life on Earth? A lone and unique lineage may have greater value to genetic diversity and future evolution. As there was no single standard, I chose as my criterion the total number of individuals of the species left in the world. This measure was the most transparent and the most directly linked to conservation threat. When I began my search, I expected that I could find a scientific study reporting total population sizes for each butterfly species purportedly among the rarest. In practice, scientists adopted a variety of methods to derive butterfly population numbers. For one example, scientists counted the number of eastern North American monarchs, Danius plexippus plexippus, on a few trees in the butterfly's overwintering grounds in Mexico, and then applied that density to the few hectares they cover there. Others caught the world's remaining Strauss's swallowtail females, one measure, and propagated them in a lab for release into the wild, another measure. One thing I enjoyed about writing this book was the opportunity to distill the results of different methods to numbers that I could compare. Butterfly life cycle. A butterfly passes through several stages as it completes its life cycle from egg to adult. Caterpillars, also called larvae, grow in about 5 stages. Each stage is called an instar. When an instar outgrows its skin or exoskeleton, it sheds it, molts, and passes to the next instar. After its final molt, it is left with a hardened outer shell, or chrysalis. The chrysalis contains the inactive larval form, a pupa, that transforms into an adult via metamorphosis. Butterflies can live through 1 or more generations each year. They can enter an inactive state, or diapause, to avoid harsh conditions such as winter weather. Different species diapause at different life stages, and the length of time a species spends at any stage is variable. For example, whereas adult overwintering monarchs can live for 6 months, Adult St. Francis's satyrs live for only 4 days. In this book, I tell the stories of 8 species and subspecies of butterflies. I have organized the book by chapter, covering the 6 rare butterflies in sequence from the most common, bay checkerspot, Euphydryas editha bayensis, to the rarest, Schaus's swallowtail, Heraclitus aristodemus pontianus. Following these are chapters on an extinct subspecies and a common subspecies. For a given species, all of the butterflies might or might not have lived in one place. To a conservation biologist, a population encompasses the area in which all the individuals of a species can interact with one another. One population is geographically separated from others. As a general rule, the total number of individual butterflies correlates with the number of populations. For example, the Fender's blue, Icaricia icarioides fenderi, occurs in more populations than, and at higher abundances than, the Schaus's swallowtail. The situation is different with the bay checkerspot and the eastern North American monarch, which are the most abundant butterflies I discuss, but which live in one population. Among the 8 butterflies I looked into, the number of populations ranged from 1 to 36, and my search turned up some butterflies that occupied few places, but were in fact very numerous relative to the others. Subspecies. Scientists have classified most of the butterflies featured in this book not as species, but as subspecies. A species, by definition, is the group of individuals that can interbreed only with one another. The subspecies category recognizes that some individuals of the same species are so geographically isolated, by, for example, distance or mountain barriers, that they will never have the opportunity to interbreed. Unlike separate species, members of different subspecies could, if brought together, interbreed. Because they are separated by such large distances, different subspecies may differ in their color, form, or behavior. One butterfly I studied in North Carolina, the St. Francis's satyr, illustrates the challenges and consequences of recognizing subspecies. At first appearance, the St. Francis's satyr looks identical to a related subspecies, the Mitchell's satyr, Neonympha michelii, which was until recently found only in Michigan. Small populations have turned up in Alabama, Mississippi, and Virginia. The scientists who first discovered the St. Francis's satyr named it a subspecies because of its distance from the other subspecies and subtle differences in appearance. Does this designation hold up when evaluated by other standards? To learn more, I collaborated with a graduate student, Chris Ham, who gathered samples and tested how closely related the populations are to one another. Chris conducted genetic analyses of 6 short segments of DNA. His analysis revealed that the Mitchell's satyr and the St. Francis's satyr are different, perhaps even different species. I included subspecies in my search because they are significant in conservation work. Subspecies are important in 4 ways. First, subspecies, and not species, represent more fully the variation of life on Earth. Second, a subspecies decline in a region is indicative of broader environmental degradation. Third, subspecies play an irreplaceable role in ecological systems. Fourth, one subspecies can provide a source to replace another subspecies of the same species if one goes extinct. For example, one subspecies of large blue butterfly that occurred in England, the British large blue, Maculinia orion utifron, went extinct before scientists understood how to conserve it. With new knowledge in hand, they were able to introduce another subspecies of large blue, Maculinia orion, from Sweden. It was successfully established. Although the genetic variation carried in the British subspecies was lost forever, the Swedish subspecies could, for the most part, fill the British large blue's ecological role. With this in mind, I chose to focus on subspecies because of their need for conservation and their relevance to ecological systems. For the remainder of the book, I sometimes use the term species for simplicity, whether I am talking about species or...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?